New updates in the Sean Diddy Combs legal saga. The rap mogul gets an official sentencing date. He gets hit with allegations from a shocking new lawsuit. A juror speaks out, and also, apparently, Diddy receives a standing ovation from inmates. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We may have a verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs trial, but I'll tell you what, this case, not over. No. Important hearing today, sort of. We got to talk about why. Well, Judge Arun Subramanian had sent a tentative October 3rd sentencing date for Diddy on his convictions of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Remember, that's what he was convicted of. He was acquitted of racketeering conspiracy, and he was acquitted of the 2 sex trafficking counts. But he was convicted of these prostitution charges. And at one point, there was reporting that defense counsel for Sean Combs and prosecutors, they had then agreed to switch the date to September 22nd. And we thought, okay, because today's hearing was supposed to be about expediting the October hearing. Then they agreed to September 22nd. Now apparently it's back to October 3rd. This is all over the place. Very confusing. We'll get it straightened out. I gotta say it's interesting because Combs' defense counsel had originally stated last week, when it was the October 3rd date, that they wanted that sentencing expedited, meaning they wanted it to happen sooner. And one of the things that Sean Combs' attorney, Mark Agnifilo, had said was, quote, the mother of some of his children had passed away many years ago. These kids, the 2 daughters here sitting in the middle of your Honor's second row, don't have a parent. Obviously referring to the death of Kim Porter in 2018, mother of Christian, Jesse, Delilah, Quincy. And by the way, remember Sean Combs was denied bail, so it wasn't even like he got to go home after the verdict. But clearly they wanted this expedited. They want his sentencing to happen as quickly as possible. They want him out of jail. They want him out of prison as soon as possible. And also it's interesting because prosecutors, they need time for the pre-sentencing investigation and report. Basically, that's when a probation officer interviews the defendant, looks at the history, the background, childhood, education, employment, criminal history, finances, the mental and physical health of the defendant. There are interviews that are conducted with family and friends. The officer looks at various court and school records, employment records, financial records. The officer could speak to the victims in the case, law enforcement that were involved in the investigation, provide all of this information in a report to the judge. Because here the judge is going to have a lot of discretion when it comes to the sentence. What could a sentence look like? Well, prosecutors indicated in a filing that before even doing a pre-sentencing investigation, Combs is looking at 51 to 63 months, a little over 4 to 5 years in prison. The defense seems to be pushing for 21 to 27 months, so a little over 1.5 to 2 years. But remember, Combs has been sitting in federal lockup since September at the MDC. So if he gets time served, he really wouldn't be spending that much time behind bars. Now, of course, there are the extremes. When you talk about transportation to engage in prostitution, the maximum for each count is 10 years in prison. You stack them together, you get 20 years. Okay, based upon the facts in this case, it seems highly unlikely he would get that much. Other side, you get the idea. There's no minimum for this charge. So could he get time served and walk free? Also seems unlikely, in that you're dealing with multiple instances of transporting Jane and Cassie, the 2 victims in this case, and men across state lines for the purposes of sex work. You could say this is an aggravating factor why I don't think he's just going to get time served. Hey everybody, this is another Law&Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. That's right, Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, just takes a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on screen, click the link below, or go to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. So, we had this hearing. Let's talk about it. Bringing back onto Sidebar, you know her very well, Law&Crime's reporter Elizabeth Millner, who, as you may know, was inside that courtroom every day for the Diddy trial. She's with me here. It's so good to see you. I haven't seen you in like 2 months in person.
I know. It's been a while.
It has been a while, and you did great reporting. You're here. We did Sidebar recaps every day. Yeah. Okay, before we get into this monumental hearing, and I'm being sarcastic, you'll see in a second, Combs' defense counsel filed a letter with the court that outlined a brand new schedule Then after the hearing, it was changed. What was the back and forth in terms of schedules? What's happening now?
I know. To your point, Jesse, it really was a back and forth. First, it was September 22nd. Now it's October 3rd. And it was something that the judge initially put on the schedule as Diddy's sentencing hearing. And then, back and forth happened. And now it's back to October 3rd, which I like to call Mean Girls Day. And so it was a lot of kind of going on here. And a lot of us were kind of confused as to, is it going to be September? Is it going to be October? But now it's official. It's going to be October. And there's a reason for it. There's a lot of stuff, like you had just mentioned, that both sides have to kind of work through. The defense was proposing that the probation office provide the parties with a pre-sentence investigation report, or a PSR, on or before August 29th. The defense objections to the PSR report will be filed on or before September 5th. And so a bunch of documents need to be filed. Diddy needs to be interviewed. Other people need to be interviewed. But it looks like we'll hear that sentencing hearing on October 3rd. It'll be kind of a big bow to a very long case. We'll see what the judge kind of goes for in terms of the sentencing. It could be, like you had mentioned, to the lower side, to the higher side. But I hate guessing in this trial at this point, because every guess that I've made has been completely wrong. So.
No, we both agreed he would get convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution, racketeering, sex trafficking, both up in the air. I'm not surprised by the jury's decision, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, and Jesse, just some more to the schedule. For any post-verdict motions, the parties proposed that the defense file any post-verdict motions on or before July 30th of this year, and the government respond on or before August 20th. And then the government requests that if they be permitted to submit its summary of offense conduct on or before July 11th of 2025, and the defense doesn't object to that. So we'll see a lot more documents being filed that we're able to kind of talk about, hopefully a little bit more, but it seems that it's just a bunch of documents that'll be filed before the eventual sentencing hearing.
You know what I think is interesting? The post-trial motions. So typically speaking, those could be like a motion for a new trial, where the court would vacate the judgment and allow for a new trial, rarely granted, but may be done if the interest of justice so requires. There's a motion for judgment of acquittal, so the court could set aside the jury's verdict, allow the defendant to go free, and there's a motion to vacate, set aside, or correct a sentence, and I'm told that it's often successful for the purpose of correcting when there's a clerical error in the sentence. Now, assuming Combs has valid legal grounds to support any of this, I imagine he will file whatever motion he can for relief from either the verdict or the sentence. Then again, I don't know. He got a very favorable ruling. Obviously, he was convicted. He's not entirely happy with it, and his defense counsel explained that. But they also, in their press conference after the verdict, they were jubilant. They were ecstatic. And I wonder if he gets a favorable sentence, is he even going to challenge this? I mean, they seem happy.
Yeah, they seem ecstatic, because the emotions that kind of ran outside of the courtroom, it was kind of double that inside the courtroom, where all the defense attorneys were hugging, they were crying. So seeing them outside in the press conference, all kind of holding hands, going up, that was just a little slice of the cake from what we all saw inside that federal courtroom. But I think it can kind of go both ways, and that's mainly because Sean Combs is still behind bars right now. The judge didn't grant him bail even after the verdict, and I think his reasoning might give us a little kind of picture into what the sentencing might possibly look like, because the judge even pointed out during his denying of Diddy's bail after his conviction, which were on counts 3 and 5, kind of talking back to what had happened in June of 2024 with Jane and the violent altercation that happened over at Jane's apartment. And so I'm thinking, if the judge is already kind of on his mind about the whole domestic violence aspect and the physical violence that was exuded from the defendant, even just last year, I think it's possible maybe the judge, even if he hears from the family, even if he hears from Sean Combs' friends, that it's possible it might be kind of a little bit of a tougher sentence than maybe the defense was expecting.
Well, look, I think the defense might be wanting to take advantage of this, right? Now, the judge said, even though I'm denying bail and I'm looking at the violence factor, it's not a preview of what I'm going to do for sentencing. But I think this is the opportunity for the defense to submit any kind of mitigating factors and have the probation officer speak to his friends and family and talk about the impact of this. I mean, we just interviewed Charlucci the other day. So I wonder if they're saying, you know what? They said to Sean Combs, listen, let's wait for October. Gives us more time to present our case to Judge Arun Subramanian. And then we had the hearing today. This monumental hearing.
It was great.
You've been in court for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
This was what, like 7 seconds?
I think maybe even less than, I would say,
What
kind
happened?
of close to 5 minutes. So
Yeah.
get all the way down to the courthouse. I'm like seeing everybody
Which
from
is not
the trial.
close from here, so people know.
it's not.
Yeah.
It's not. And it was hot outside too. So
all the way downtown,
walking
yeah.
all the way down, or not, I didn't walk all the way downtown, from the subway to the walk to the courthouse.
Okay.
Get there, check in on my stuff. I would say the security check-in was longer than the actual hearing.
Okay.
So it was a remote hearing. We didn't see Sean Combs in person. We didn't see any of the attorneys on both sides. We didn't even see the judge. And so what had happened was we get inside kind of the overflow room.
Oh, the overflow room, okay.
Yep. So we get inside the overflow room. There's a big giant screen. It's completely black, but then you hear Sean Combs's voice being like, Mark, are you there? And so it was kind of like one of those dial-in type of hearings. And so we heard Mark Agnifilo's voice. Then all of a sudden we hear the prosecution's voice. It was Christy Slavic. She was accompanied by Emily Johnson, both who work on behalf of the government. And then all of a sudden, Mark Agnifilo was kind of like, you know what, we were able to work everything out as far as our sentencing date goes. And then the judge's clerk is like, oh, okay, so both parties agree, and then this matter is adjourned.
And that was it.
Yeah.
I worried that's what was going to be, because when they had the letter basically working out the date, I was like, oh, what are they going to talk about? And then after that hearing is when they switched it back to October 3rd.
Yeah.
So not much there. You didn't see Sean Combs. Okay. Let's talk about some other things that have been going on. First of all, big news, there's a new lawsuit that came out against Sean Combs, okay? This is pretty disgusting. You have this unidentified John Doe who claims that in September of 2020, so relatively recently, he, Diddy, and others, they go to this warehouse out in LA that apparently contains some of the clothes of Notorious B.I.G., the rapper who was shot and killed in 1997, Sean Combs' friend. And people start taking drugs. They start wandering around this warehouse. And this John Doe claims that Combs started watching pornography on his phone. And that is when he claims, again, warning, pretty disgusting allegation, that Combs grabbed one of Biggie's t-shirts and pleasured himself with it, into it. I don't know how the best way to explain it. And even alleging that John Doe, or insisting that John Doe finish the job, so to speak. And he then claimed Combs threw the spoiled shirt onto John Doe and said, "Rip Biggie," then left. He also claimed that 15 years earlier, Combs told him to perform oral sex on him, reportedly suing for intentional infliction of emotional distress, sexual battery. Don't have a ton of information, but for somebody who has been following so many of the civil lawsuits that he now faces, 66, 67, 68. How does this fit into all of them?
Well, it seems like it's just kind of showing a pattern that all the lawsuits seem to kind of allege of power, control, sexual pleasure, all of that stuff. I would say the timing of it is a little surprising given that it came after the verdict a little bit, but I think it kind of, again, goes to that pattern that a lot of the other civil suits we've seen, and these can be by just different attorneys too. It's not always the same attorney who's filing these suits, but it seems like they all kind of go to this pattern, it seems. But again, I'm just more surprised at the timing of it and when this was filed too.
To be clear, there are lawsuits that he's facing that contain allegations that were never discussed in any way in the criminal case.
Right.
But in the criminal case, was it ever alleged that he sexually assaulted men? Was it ever alleged that he grabbed men or forced them to do things, or was it mostly focused upon women?
Seems like it was mostly focused on women, and that being the victims in this case. I think as far as just kind of the allegations towards men were really just having to do with the escorts or the entertainers, as they were also called in the criminal trial. But for the most part, it seemed like from what we heard in the criminal trial, which I know a lot of people are a little disappointed because they thought it would be a lot more, but really it was just kind of like just different isolated incidents involving two victims, being Jane and Cassie. But it seemed like there wasn't a lot of discussion about male victims in this trial, but there were little points that were brought up in terms of like the civil matters, those including like Bonna and her civil claim, Dawn Richard and her civil claim. I think even during the cross-examination of Cassie, one of the defense attorneys, that would be Anna Esteval, she had asked, you know, was the baby oil laced? And I was thinking back to the civil claims, because a lot of civil claims had, a lot of civil suits had claimed that
And it wasn't laced.
That it was, the civil suits claimed it was laced, but then in the criminal trial, Cassie had confirmed that the baby oil was never laced with any type of narcotics or anything like that.
By the way, Combs' legal team said in a statement to Page 6, quote, Mr. Combs' trial and acquittal on trafficking and RICO charges proves what we have been saying all along. Mr. Combs never sexually assaulted or trafficked anyone. That people continue to broadcast and file false accusations, no matter how heinous and uncorroborated, is unfortunate. But Mr. Combs will not back down. He will fight for as long as necessary to win his full vindication. I talked about it on a previous sidebar how he might tackle all these lawsuits, maybe motions to dismiss, maybe try to say, you know, these Jane and John Doe shouldn't proceed under pseudonyms. If you can convince a court of that, they may be reluctant to continue the case if they have to expose their identities. He might try to get rid of them at initial stages as much as possible.
And he was successful at that at the beginning, too.
Yeah, a few of them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about the jurors, okay? So first, a juror has spoken out since the verdict. Not surprising, we had a feeling this would happen. This unnamed juror apparently spoke to ABC and said that the public reaction to this decision, quote, is highly insulting and belittling to the jury and the deliberation process. We spent over 2 days deliberating. Our decision was based solely on the evidence presented and how the law is stated. We would have treated any defendant in the same manner regardless of who they are. I have nothing else to say. Now, you watch the jury, okay? And we'll talk about what an alternate juror had to say too, but you watch the jury. You watch them day in and day out. What do you make of that statement?
I was a little surprised by that statement, just a little bit, only because, and I shouldn't say anything surprising to me when it comes to this trial, I found that statement surprising only because we clearly had heard the same evidence. Obviously, they saw a little bit more than I saw being inside the gallery. Some of the exhibits we weren't able to see, that sort, and that included, you know, the freak-off tapes, the hotel night tapes, all of that stuff. And so I was surprised by the jury's decision. It's mainly to count 2. Not as surprised.
Sex trafficking.
Yeah, sex trafficking and Cassie. Yeah, not really surprised with count 1 or even count 4 either.
So racketeering and sex trafficking.
Yeah, I know. I'm just naming the counts, not actually specifying them or anything. But I get also why the juror made that very pointed statement too, because given the backlash that this jury has faced, given that a lot of people were kind of upset with the jury's decision. I mean, again, we had heard the same evidence. They saw a little bit more than obviously I saw. And so I respect the jury's decision. They were able to deliberate. I was surprised that they didn't deliberate a little longer, I'll say that. But, you know, they're regular people, men and women, just like everybody else. And so the way they interpreted it is the way they interpreted it. And, you know, even though I'm surprised by their outcome, I'm not surprised also by that statement either.
When the juror says how the law is stated, see, that's what stood out to me. Because to me it says, hey, we couldn't magically turn this evidence into a federal crime that he was charged with. I mean, very specific elements of RICO and sex trafficking. We weren't tasked with finding him guilty of domestic violence. We were tasked with finding him guilty of beating Cassandra Ventura. Is it RICO? Is it sex trafficking? And, you know, did the prosecution prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt? Clearly they didn't. You followed the case. Did you think it was razor's edge? You could say, you know what, I get it. I understand. At the same time, you could say, wait a minute, I think the prosecution ticked off all the boxes of that. Because I think it was, to me, and I don't know, I'm reading the tea leaves, they probably looked at this and said, it just doesn't fit with what the prosecution's trying to sell. Everybody says the case, a lot of people say the case was overcharged. I don't know if that's true, but at the very least, it seems like they had struggle trying to say there was a criminal enterprise. They had struggle saying that there was force, fraud, coercion that was used against Cassie and Jane, that maybe they were willing participants or was consensual. I think it just muddied the waters a little bit. And not to take away from the testimony, but how the law is stated was interesting to me. Yeah,
it was interesting to me too, especially when it came to count 1, that being RICO conspiracy. At the back of my mind, I kind of wondered, were the jurors caught up on the whole conspiracy aspect? And did the closing arguments done by the defense really ring in their ear in terms of why weren't the co-conspirators called? Why was one of the alleged co-conspirators inside the gallery during the closing arguments, that being Fahim Muhammad, you know, somebody that the prosecution had talked about ad nauseum, in addition to Christina Coram, aka KK. So I think, like, in terms of the conspiracy aspect, when it came to the predicate acts of drug distribution and arson and even bribery, I felt like the prosecution made very strong cases for those arguments, especially those particular predicate acts. Maybe forced labor I kind of understood. Maybe some of the other stuff I kind of understood. But I was really surprised that they didn't check at least maybe 2 of those boxes, but then that would have made him guilty of RICO conspiracy. And so I think the prosecution tried their best to really kind of point it out in terms of the law, and they did I think a great job in their closing argument, but was it enough to sway the jury? Obviously not, by the decision that they made.
What about this alternate juror? So this juror who was not part of the actual deliberation spoke out on CNN, unnamed, said, "I understood the final verdict. Reading all my notes, looking back at the evidence, I probably would have reached the same conclusion as the other jurors. If we're looking at it from one side, it was definitely riveting and eye-opening," as he told Laura Coates from CNN, and that he didn't think Cassie didn't seem forced in the videos that were shown. It was actually pretty tame. It was a lot of rubbing oil and stuff on there. It wasn't anything too graphic. What'd you make of that?
It was interesting, especially I think the juror, or the alternate juror that this came from. This was a juror that a lot of us kind of noticed in the press line a little bit. He was very smiley. He seemed very approachable in the sense that he came into the courtroom all the time, had a smile on his face. He was smiling over at the defense table, the prosecution table. He would look at us in the gallery sometimes. And so it was surprising to hear that he said the freak-off tapes, or the sexually explicit tapes, were tame in nature, because I always felt like watching them watch the tapes, because, you know, when that was being played, we weren't able to see it, we weren't able to hear it. All of the jurors had headphones on, so we were trying to just watch and glance over at their facial expressions. And I'm sure it can be kind of a blushing moment and a little embarrassing to watch those sexually explicit tapes and stuff like that, especially in a courtroom while everybody's eyes are on you, and while over at the defense's table and even the prosecution table, everybody's just watching these tapes. And so I think maybe a lot of people have different definitions possibly of what force, fraud, or coercion even might consist of, in a way, because you know, for the government's allegations, or the government's case, they were trying to say it only had to be one instance, whereas, you know, the defense was kind of like, okay, well, if 75 were consensual, what makes the 76 all of a sudden sex trafficking? So it seems like the defense made a very strong argument, a strong enough argument that I think that the jury kind of resonated with in some sense. But I'm really surprised that he said that the freak-off tapes were tame, especially given that there's been so much kind of controversy and talk about these tapes being so graphic and explicit.
There's been a lot of reaction. And how about this? I mean, Combs' spokesperson said that the rap mogul, received a standing ovation when he came back to the MDC, Metropolitan Detention Center, after this monumental verdict. Mark Agnifilo reportedly telling the Associated Press, "They all said, we never get to see anyone who beats the government." What do you make of that? That surprise you?
Yeah, well, it doesn't surprise me, that statement, because he made the same statement to the Combs family inside the courtroom too. The standing ovation also not very surprising, because, you know, they're all a bunch of detainees. They're all probably wanting somebody to come back with a win, and of course the win being from the mogul himself, that being Sean Combs. I think, you know, they probably gave him the exact amount of love maybe they would give other high-profile defendants who are also incarcerated at that same detention facility. So it's not surprising that people were happy for him. But I think people also have to remember he's still there at MDC Brooklyn, and it's because he's still convicted on 2 of the charges that he was found guilty of. And so I'm not surprised at all that the detainees there had that very kind of welcoming reaction to his verdict.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to keep a careful eye on what happens next, but it seems all eyes right now, October 3rd for sentencing, although I will tell you, let's be on the lookout for some of those motions. They could be very interesting to see, but October 3rd is going to be the big date. I'm sure you're going to be there for sentencing.
Oh yeah, I'll be there.
Elizabeth Millner, great seeing you.
Thank you so much, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.